Vinicius Martin sat in the VIP lounge at the Lisbon airport, his eyes skimming over the financial reports on his tablet. Another successful conference behind him, another deal in the making. His life had become a routine of success: business meetings, luxury hotels, and private jets. But lately, he had started to feel a sense of hollowness gnawing at the edges of his carefully curated life. He dismissed it as fatigue. As he waited for his flight back to Sao Paulo, something caught his eye. A young woman walked past him, her eyes fixed on the arrivals board. There was something about her posture, the way she moved, the subtle tension in her expression, that made him pause. She couldn't have been more than 20, maybe a little older, but there was something unervingly familiar about her. Vinicius found himself watching her for a moment longer than he should have. She was wearing a simple, stylish jacket and jeans, her long, dark hair tied back in a loose ponytail. It wasn't just her face that tugged at him, though her features stirred a memory he couldn't place. It was something deeper. He couldn't shake the feeling that he knew her, or at least should know her. Just as he was about to look away, a woman appeared next to her. His heart stopped. Luisa. Vinicius stiffened in his seat, his tablet forgotten in his hands. It had been 15 years since he had last seen her, since the night he had walked out on their marriage, and everything they had built. He hadn't looked back. Until now. Luisa hadn't changed much. Her dark curls were now streaked with gray, but her face still held the same quiet strength he remembered. She spoke to the young woman, who smiled faintly. Then they both turned to leave. As they passed, Vinicius caught a glimpse of the girl's face again, and that's when it hit him. She had his eyes. The thought slammed into him like a punch to the gut. He sat frozen in his seat, his mind racing. Could it be? No! It was impossible. When he left Luisa, there was no mention of children. She hadn't been pregnant, or at least, she hadn't told him if she was. But that girl, she couldn't be anyone else's daughter. His daughter. Vinicius watched them as they made their way through the terminal. His pulse quickened. The years of distance between him and Luisa suddenly felt like they had collapsed in an instant. Guilt, long buried, clawed its way to the surface. Had she kept the child from him all these years? Why hadn't she said anything? And more importantly, how had he missed this? He stood up abruptly, almost knocking over his glass of water in the process. He didn't know what he was going to do, but he couldn't let them disappear from his life again. Not this time. Vinicius followed them at a distance, keeping them in sight as they navigated through the bustling airport crowd. As he moved, memories flooded back. Memories of the early days with Luisa, the way they had dreamed of building a life together. But those dreams had turned sour when his ambitions grew too big for the small town where they lived. He had wanted more than she could give him, more than the quiet life they shared. And so, one night, without much of a fight, he had left. He never looked back. He had built the life he always wanted: wealth, success, respect. But now, as he trailed behind the two women he had once loved and left behind, it all felt meaningless. Luisa and the girl, Clara, that had beer name, stopped at a cafe near the gates. Vinicius hesitated, unsure of his next move. What was he doing? He couldn't just walk up to them and explain himself after all these years. What would he even say? Sorry, I abandoned you before I knew you existed. He stood in the shadows, watching as they sat down, oblivious to his presence. Clara laughed at something Luisa said, and for a brief moment, Vinicius felt like a ghost, someone who no longer had any place in their lives. But that wasn't true, was it? Clara was his daughter, his, and he had a right to know her, didn't he? Vinicius clenched his fists, a mixture of regret and determination swirling in his chest. He knew he couldn't just walk away again. This time, he had to face the truth, no matter how painful it would be. 15 years ago, Vinicius Martins was a very different man. Back then, he wasn't the successful businessman he had become. He was ambitious, restless, and full of dreams that felt too big for the small town of Penedo, where he lived with Luisa, his wife. Penedo was quaint and charming, tucked into the countryside, but to Vinicius, it felt like a cage. At first, life with Luisa had been good. She was an artist, free-spirited and full of life. Vinicius had been drawn to her creativity, her way of seeing the world through colors and textures. But as the years passed, her contentment with their quiet life began to grate on him. While Luisa found fulfillment in her small art gallery, Vinicius felt stifled. His ambition grew, gnawing at him, pushing him to want more money, more recognition, more success. They started arguing more frequently. The love they had shared seemed to fade with every fight about his long hours at work, his obsession with money, and her refusal to leave Pinedo for a bigger city. Luisa wanted to settle down, to start a family, but Vinicius wasn't ready for that. Not then. One night, after yet another argument, something in him snapped. They had been fighting over the same things, his constant dissatisfaction, her unwillingness to change. He couldn't take it anymore. As Luisa pleaded with him to stay, to find happiness in the life they had built together, Vinicius felt only the weight of his frustrations. "This isn't enough, Luisa," he had said, his voice hard. "I want more. I need more. And I need you," she replied, her eyes filled with tears. Why can't that be enough? He couldn't answer her. He didn't have the words. All he knew was that something was pulling him away, and he couldn't resist it any longer. That night, while Luisa slept, Vinicius packed a bag. He stood for a long time by the window, looking out at the quiet streets of the town he had once loved, and then he looked at the woman lying in their bed. A part of him knew he was making a mistake, that he was throwing away something real, something solid. But the part of him that craved more was louder. He scribbled a note, short, almost cold, and left it on the kitchen table. By the time the sun rose, Vinicius was gone. For the next few weeks, he shut out the memories of Luisa and Pinedo. He told himself he had made the right choice. He moved to Sao Paulo, the city where his ambition could finally take flight. His career took off faster than he expected. He climbed the corporate ladder, making connections, taking risks that paid off handsomely. The guilt he felt about leaving Luisa became easier to ignore as his bank account grew, and his name became synonymous with success. But he never knew. He never knew that Luisa had been pregnant when he left. He never knew that just days after he disappeared from her life, she had discovered the truth. Alone and heartbroken, Luisa had raised their child without him. Clara had been born into a world where Vinicius was a ghost, a man who had left before he even knew she existed. Vinicius never thought to look back. In his mind, the chapter of his life with Luisa had closed the moment he walked out that door. He didn't know that another chapter had opened without him. Now, standing in the present, his mind flashed back to those moments, the cold decisions he made, the dreams he chased, and the life he left behind. How could he have been so blind? How could he have walked away from something that now felt more important than anything he had gained? His success, the wealth, the status. It all felt hollow when compared to the life he had abandoned. What had it all been for? Vinicius hadn't thought about Luisa in years, and he had never once imagined he had a daughter out there, growing up without a father. But now that he knew, it was like a weight crashing down on him, a truth too heavy to ignore. He couldn't change what he had done. He couldn't undo the past. But maybe, just maybe, he could try to fix the future. Vinicius sat in his hotel room, the weight of the revelation pressing heavily on his chest. He had spent the entire day trying to gather himself, pacing the floor, replaying every moment in his head. He couldn't stop thinking about the girl he'd seen at the airport, the one with his eyes. It was undeniable now. Clara was his daughter. His heart pounded with the weight of it. After hours of agonizing over what to do next, Vinicius reached out to an old friend, Marcelo, a mutual acquaintance from the days when he and Luisa were still together. Marcelo had stayed in touch with Luisa over the years, and if anyone could confirm what Vinicius already suspected, it would be him. Vinicius's fingers hovered over his phone as he dialed the number, unsure of what to expect. The phone rang twice before Marcelo's voice answered, calm and familiar. Vinicius, long time, Marcelo said, his voice tinged with a mix of surprise and curiosity. I wasn't expecting to hear from you after all this time. I know, Vinicius replied, trying to keep his voice steady. It's been a while. Listen, I need to ask you something. It's about Luisa. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a brief hesitation. What about her? Marcelo asked cautiously. Vinicius swallowed hard, the words feeling strange as they left his mouth. I think I saw her today with a young woman. Marcelo, is Clara my daughter? The silence that followed was deafening. Vinicius could almost hear Marcelo processing the question, the weight of it settling between them like a heavy fog. Finally, Marcelo sighed. Yes, he said quietly. Clara is your daughter. Vinicius closed his eyes, his chest tightening as the confirmation hit him. There it was, the truth he had been running from for 15 years, now standing in front of him like a wall he could no longer avoid. Marcelo continued, his voice softer now. Luisa never told you, did she? Marcelo asked, though it was more of a statement than a question. No, Vinicius replied, his voice barely above a whisper. I had no idea. Marcelo exhaled deeply. She found out she was pregnant just after you left. It was hard for her, raising Clara on her own, but she did it. She never reached out to you, Vinicius. I think she was too hurt, too proud. And, well, after a while, it was too late. Vinicius slumped into the nearest chair, his mind reeling. He couldn't imagine what Luisa had gone through, raising a child alone, knowing that the man who should have been there had disappeared without a word. And Clara, his daughter, how much had he missed? Her first steps, her first words, her entire childhood, gone just like that. Does she know? Vinicius asked suddenly, his voice urgent. Does Clara know who I am? She knows, Marcelo replied, his tone careful. But she's not interested in having a relationship with you, Vinicius. As far as she's concerned, you're the man who left her mother before she was even born. The words cut deep, but Vinicius couldn't argue with them. What right did he have to expect anything different? He had walked away from Luisa without a second thought, and now he was paying the price for that decision. But still, the thought of Clara rejecting him before he even had the chance to know her gnawed at him. Marcelo, Vinicius said, his voice shaky. I have to try. I can't just walk away from her again. I need to make this right, somehow. There was another pause, and when Marcelo spoke again, his voice was somber. It's not going to be easy, Vinicius. Luisa's not going to let you just waltz back into their lives. And Clara, well, she's got her own mind. But if you're serious about this, I'll give you Luisa's contact. You'll have to take it from there. Vinicius nodded, though Marcelo couldn't see him. Thank you, he whispered, feeling a mix of gratitude and fear. I don't know what I'm going to say, but I have to try. After hanging up the phone, Vinicius sat in silence, the reality of what he had just learned settling over him like a heavy blanket. He had a daughter who wanted nothing to do with him. For the first time in years, Vinicius felt truly lost. All the success, all the wealth, the power, none of it mattered now. Not if he couldn't make things right with Clara. He stared out the hotel window, the city lights of Lisbon twinkling below him. Somewhere out there, Luisa and Clara were living their lives, completely unaware of the storm that was now raging inside him. Vinicius had no idea how he was going to do it, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to give up this time. He had lost them once. He couldn't lose them again. Vinicius sat in his car, parked just across the street from the small art gallery in Lisbon. He had been there for hours, watching as people came and went, waiting for the moment when he might finally see them. His fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel, his mind racing with everything that could go wrong. He had gotten Luisa's contact information from Marcelo a few days earlier, but couldn't bring himself to call her. What would he say? What could he possibly say that would make up for 15 years of absence? He thought it might be easier to see her in person, to see both of them, and hoped that something would guide him in the moment. The gallery was modest but busy. Through the large front windows, Vinicius could see the artwork on display. Mostly abstract paintings, splashes of color that seemed to capture emotion in ways words couldn't. This was Luisa's world. He could feel it. She had always been drawn to bold expressions, to things that spoke without speaking. Then he saw them. Luisa and Clara walked into the gallery together, chatting like old friends. Vinicius's heart leapt into his throat as he watched them, unsure of what to do next. Clara looked every bit the confident young woman he had imagined, her long hair flowing behind her, her face a mixture of concentration and ease. Luisa, beside her, looked just as poised, as if the years had only added layers of strength to the woman he once knew. His hands shook as he opened the car door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. This was it, the moment he had been dreading and longing for in equal measure. He crossed the street slowly, his mind swirling with what he might say, what he might do to make this right. When he entered the gallery, the cool air and the soft hum of conversation hit him all at once. He spotted Luisa and Clara near the back, admiring a painting together. For a brief second, he considered turning around, walking back out, pretending this never happened. But he knew he couldn't run anymore. He'd done enough of that. He took a deep breath and approached them. "Luisa," he said softly, his voice shaky. She turned toward him slowly, her eyes widening in shock. There was a moment of silence that felt like it stretched forever. Clara, standing beside her, looked from her mother to Vinicius, confusion crossing her face. "Vinicius." Luisa's voice was almost a whisper, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Vinicius opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. All the speeches he had rehearsed in his head evaporated. Instead, he just stood there, awkward and small, waiting for her reaction. Luisa's eyes hardened quickly, the initial shock giving way to anger. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, stepping in front of Clara protectively, as if shielding her from him. I needed to see you," Vinicius stammered, his voice thick with emotion. "To see both of you." Clara, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. Her voice was cold, sharp. "You've got to be kidding me." Vinicius turned to her, his chest tightening. "Clara, please. I know you have no reason to want to talk to me. I know I haven't been there. You think..." She cut him off, her eyes flashing with a fury that caught him off guard. "You abandoned my mother. You abandoned me. You don't get to just show up here and pretend like none of that happened." "I'm not pretending," Vinicius said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not here to make excuses. I need you to know that I'm sorry. I made mistakes, terrible mistakes, and I've been paying for them ever since." Luisa, still standing between them, shook her head, her expression a mix of disbelief and contempt. "Sorry? You think sorry is enough after all these years? You think you can waltz back into our lives and fix everything with an apology?" Vinicius took a step back, feeling the weight of their words pressing down on him. "I know I can't fix everything. I'm not asking for forgiveness right now. I need a chance. A chance to explain, a chance to make things right." Clara laughed bitterly. "Make things right? There's nothing you can do to fix this. You weren't there when we needed you. You missed everything. My whole life." Her words were a punch to his gut, each one landing harder than the last. But she was right. He had missed everything, and there was nothing he could say that would change that. All he could do was try. "I know I can't undo the past," Vinicius said softly, "but I'm here now. I just want to be part of your life. If you'll let me." Clara stared at him, her face hard, unflinching. Then she turned to Luisa. "I'm done here." Without another word, Clara walked past Vinicius, her shoulder brushing against his as she stormed out of the gallery. Luisa followed her with her eyes, then turned back to Vinicius, her expression unreadable. "She's right, you know," Luisa said quietly. "You missed everything." Vinicius nodded, feeling the weight of her words. I know. Louisa sighed, then walked away, leaving Vinicius standing alone in the middle of the gallery, surrounded by the echoes of the life he had left behind. Days had passed since Vinicius's attempt to reconnect with Clara, but the sting of rejection still clung to him. He had replayed the scene at the gallery over and over in his head. The way Clara's eyes flashed with anger, the coldness in her voice as she told him he had missed her entire life. And she was right. He had missed it all. Vinicius sat in his office in Sao Paulo, the city's skyline stretching out before him through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It had been a place of triumph for him, where he had built his empire, amassed his wealth, and earned his place among the most powerful businessmen in the country. But now, none of it seemed to matter. Every success, every victory felt hollow. What good was all this if he couldn't fix things with his daughter? He leaned back in his leather chair, his thoughts heavy. The weight of his decisions was finally catching up to him, and it was more than just the guilt about Clara and Louisa. Over the years, Vinicius had made choices that, while profitable, weren't always ethical. He had bent the rules, cut corners, and made deals with people whose methods were questionable at best. It had all seemed justified at the time. Necessary sacrifices in the pursuit of success. But now, those decisions were coming back to haunt him. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His assistant, Patricia, stepped in, her usual calm demeanor replaced with something more serious. "Vinicius," she said softly, "we received another inquiry from the Financial Regulatory Board. They're asking for more documents regarding the latest deals with those offshore accounts." Vinicius felt his stomach drop. It wasn't the first time the board had raised questions about his company's dealings, but it was the first time they had pushed this hard. He had managed to keep things quiet until now, but the pressure was mounting. "Tell them we're cooperating fully," Vinicius replied, his voice steady despite the growing unease inside him. "And get our legal team on this. I want them ready for anything." Patricia nodded and left, but the tension in the room remained. As soon as the door closed, Vinicius rubbed his temples, the weight of everything crashing down on him. The cracks in his life were widening, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep everything together. He had always been able to compartmentalize his guilt, his questionable business practices, and his personal failings. But now, it was all colliding. And Clara, the thought of her loomed over everything. Her rejection wasn't just a blow to his ego. It was a reflection of everything he had lost, everything he had sacrificed in the name of success. But how could he even begin to fix things with her if his entire career, his entire empire, was built on shaky ground? Vinicius leaned forward, resting his head in his hands. The life he had chosen, the life that had seemed so glamorous, so full of promise, was unraveling faster than he could manage. The thought of losing everything terrified him. But what terrified him more was the realization that none of it really mattered anymore. Not without his daughter in his life. On the other side of the city, Clara sat at a cafe with her best friend, Julia. They had known each other since high school, and Julia had been the one person Clara could always count on, through the good and the bad. "He just showed up," Clara said, still in disbelief. "After all these years, he just walked into the gallery like it was nothing, like he could just come back." Julia frowned, stirring her coffee. "And what did your mom say?" "She didn't say much," Clara replied, shaking her head. "I mean, she was shocked too, but she didn't stop him from talking. It's like she didn't know what to do either." Julia looked at her friend carefully. "And what about you? How do you feel?" Clara sighed, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "I don't know, Julia. I hate him for leaving us, for leaving my mom. I grew up without a dad because of him. But at the same time, now that he's here, I don't know what to do with all this anger. It's like I've been carrying it around for so long, and now that he's actually standing in front of me, I don't know what to do." Julia nodded slowly. "It makes sense. I mean, he's your dad, but he's also a stranger. And it's not like he can just walk back into your life and fix everything." "Exactly," Clara said, slumping back in her chair. And to make it worse, I did some digging online. He's not exactly the guy people think he is. His whole business empire, it's shady. There are investigations into his company, possible fraud, money laundering. All of it. Julia's eyes widened. Are you serious? Clara nodded. Yeah. So not only did he abandon us, but he built his life on lies. And now he wants to, what, reconnect? Like that's even possible. Clara clenched her fists, the anger swirling inside her again. How could someone like him think he could just show up after all this time and expect things to be different, to be forgiven? She didn't know what Vinicius's motives were, but she wasn't going to make it easy for him. Not after everything he had done. Vinicius paced the marble floors of his office, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on him. The walls that once symbolized power and success now felt suffocating. His once untouchable empire was crumbling. The investigations had escalated, and his legal team was running out of ways to stall the regulators. The knock on the door came abruptly, followed by his assistant Patricia stepping in, her face as tense as the situation. They want to meet with you, Vinicius, she said softly. The regulatory board. They've uncovered more evidence of the offshore accounts, and they're threatening to bring criminal charges if we don't cooperate fully. Vinicius stopped pacing and turned to face her, the reality of the situation settling in. For years, he had danced around the edges of legality, always managing to stay one step ahead of any real consequences. But this time, he could feel the walls closing in. How bad is it? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Patricia hesitated, then spoke the words that hit him like a punch. It's bad. If they go through with this, you could lose everything. The company, your assets, even your freedom. Vinicius felt his stomach drop. Losing his company was one thing. He had built it from the ground up, and watching it fall apart would be devastating. But the thought of losing his freedom, of spending time in prison, was something he hadn't truly considered until now. The life he had worked so hard to create, the life he had sacrificed so much for, was on the verge of collapse. He nodded slowly, signaling Patricia to leave. Once she was gone, he sat at his desk, staring at the framed photo of himself shaking hands with an international CEO. A reminder of the days when everything seemed within his grasp. Those days were long gone. Now, all he had were the consequences of his actions, looming larger by the second. At home, his wife Fernanda paced the living room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor in sharp, angry bursts. She had been furious ever since the news broke about the investigations. For years, she had enjoyed the life of luxury that came with being married to Vinicius. The parties, the travel, the status. But now, everything was at risk. You need to fix this, Fernanda snapped, her voice cutting through the silence as Vinicius walked through the door that evening. Do you realize what this will do to us? To me? I can't be seen as the wife of a criminal. Vinicius didn't respond immediately. He was exhausted, mentally and emotionally drained. The weight of everything, the company, the legal issues, Clara, had him on edge. He wasn't sure how much more he could take. I'm doing everything I can, he said quietly, sinking into the nearest chair. That's not enough. Fernanda's voice rose, sharp and unrelenting. If you go down, we lose everything. Our reputation, our friends. I won't live like that. Vinicius looked up at her, seeing for the first time the thinly veiled disgust in her eyes. This wasn't about him. This was about the life she had built on his success, the one she refused to let slip away. There had been a time when Vinicius might have fought to keep that life intact, but now it all seemed meaningless. As Fernanda continued her tirade, Vinicius realized that, despite everything, the only thing he truly cared about now was Clara. Not the company, not the money, and certainly not the marriage that was little more than a facade. He had spent too many years living for things that no longer mattered. I'll handle it, he said flatly, cutting Fernanda off. But don't expect me to save you from this. Fernanda blinked, caught off guard by his sudden coldness. She stared at him, trying to gauge what was happening. But for the first time in their marriage, Vinicius felt nothing for her. No need to reassure, no need to apologize. The divide between them had been growing for years, and now it was too wide to bridge. Without another word, Fernanda stormed out of the room, leaving Vinicius alone with his thoughts. The next morning, Vinicius sat in his car outside the regulatory board's office. His palms were sweaty, his nerves frayed. The meeting ahead could very well determine his future. His legal team had advised him to cooperate as much as possible, to show that he was willing to make amends. But even as he prepared to face the consequences of his actions, his mind drifted back to Clara. He hadn't reached out to her since the disastrous encounter at the gallery. What would be the point? She hated him, but a part of him still held on to the hope that once he had dealt with the mess of his business life, he could try again. He could try to be the father she never had. But first, he had to survive this. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was tense. The panel of regulators sat across from him, their faces stern, their eyes unwavering. Vinicius's lawyer sat beside him, flipping through the pages of the documents they had brought in hopes of softening the blow. But Vinicius knew, deep down, that this was far beyond saving. The lead investigator, a woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense tone, spoke first. "Mr. Martins, we've uncovered substantial evidence of financial misconduct, offshore accounts, fraudulent transactions, money laundering. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Vinicius swallowed hard, his mouth dry. His lawyer had prepared a statement, but as he opened his mouth to speak, he realized there was no point in denying the truth. He had done those things. He had built his empire on lies, and now the truth was catching up with him. "No," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "I have no defense." The room fell silent. His lawyer shot him a sharp look, but Vinicius didn't care. The fight was over. His empire was crumbling, and all that was left was a rubble of the choices he had made. As the meeting continued, outlining the charges and the impending legal consequences, Vinicius sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had spent his life chasing success, but in the end, he had lost what really mattered. Now, all he had left was a hope that, maybe one day, Clara would give him another chance. Vinicius stood outside Luisa's apartment, his heart pounding in his chest. He had replayed this moment 100 times in his head since the last time he saw her and Clara in the gallery. Now, with his world collapsing around him, he knew there was only one thing left to do: face the truth with Luisa. He raised his hand to knock on the door, but hesitated, his mind racing. What could he possibly say that would make a difference now? He had betrayed her, abandoned her, and left her to raise a daughter he didn't even know existed. But he had to try. He couldn't move forward without first trying to make amends for the pain he had caused. The door opened before he could knock, catching him off guard. Luisa stood there, her eyes narrowing as soon as she saw him. She didn't say anything at first, but her expression said it all. She had been expecting him, and she wasn't happy about it. "Luisa, Vinicius began, but she cut him off before he could finish. "Why are you here, Vinicius?" she asked, her voice sharp but controlled. "Haven't you done enough already?" Vinicius felt the weight of her words, but he pressed on. I need to talk to you. Please. I know I don't deserve it, but I need to explain." Luisa's eyes flashed with anger, but after a moment, she stepped aside, letting him into the small, warmly lit apartment. It felt like stepping into a different world, one full of color and life, far removed from the sterile, corporate spaces he was used to. She closed the door and stood facing him, arms crossed, waiting. "I know you hate me," Vinicius began, his voice trembling slightly. "And you have every right to. I left you. I left you alone, and I didn't know about Clara. I didn't know, but that doesn't excuse anything. I made terrible choices, and I've regretted them every single day since I saw you again." Luisa remained silent, her eyes locked on him. Her expression was hard, but Vinicius could see the hurt beneath it, the pain that had been festering for years. I can't undo the past, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. But I want to make things right. I want to be there for Clara, if she'll let me. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want a chance. Louisa shook her head, her face a mixture of disbelief and anger. A chance? After 15 years, you want a chance? She laughed bitterly. Do you have any idea what you did to us, Vinicius? Do you have any idea what it was like to raise a child alone, to watch her grow up without a father because you decided you wanted something more? I didn't know she existed, Vinicius said, his voice barely above a whisper. You didn't care, Louisa snapped. That's the truth, isn't it? You didn't care enough to stay. You didn't care enough to see what you were leaving behind. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. She was right. Back then, he hadn't cared enough to stay. He had been so consumed by his ambition, by the desire to escape what he saw as a small, limiting life, that he hadn't stopped to think about what he was abandoning. I was selfish, Vinicius admitted, his eyes lowering in shame. I thought I was chasing success, but I was really running away from my responsibilities. And now, I've lost everything. Louisa raised an eyebrow. Everything? Vinicius nodded. The company is falling apart. I'm under investigation. I might go to prison. I don't care about any of that anymore. What I care about now is Clara. She's all that matters. For the first time, Louisa's expression softened slightly. She sighed, shaking her head as if to clear the overwhelming emotion swirling inside her. She's not going to forgive you easily, Vinicius, Louisa said, her voice quieter now, more thoughtful. You weren't there for her, and she's built her life without you. It's going to take more than just showing up to fix this. I know, Vinicius replied, his voice barely a whisper. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I'll wait. I'll prove to her that I'm not the same man who left all those years ago. Louisa looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether she could believe him. Finally, she spoke. Clara is strong, but she's also fragile in ways you don't understand. You walking back into her life has stirred up things she spent years trying to bury. Louisa paused, her voice tightening. Don't make promises you can't keep. Don't break her heart again, Vinicius. If you hurt her, I'll never forgive you. Vinicius nodded, the weight of her warning settling on him like a heavy blanket. He knew he had no right to ask for anything, but he also knew he couldn't give up, not now. He had to earn Clara's trust, however long that took. Thank you, he said softly, though he knew it wasn't enough. Louisa gave him one last look, her eyes a mixture of lingering hurt and reluctant hope. Don't thank me. This is all on you now. Vinicius sat in the small, sterile room, the cold metal of the chair biting into his back. Across from him, his lawyer shuffled through a stack of papers, the weight of the situation pressing down on both of them. The final confession had been written, reviewed, and was now ready to be signed. After months of negotiations, it had all come down to this. Once he signed those papers, there would be no turning back. He would lose everything, his company, his assets, his freedom. But in some strange way, it was almost a relief. After years of hiding behind lies and manipulation, of chasing success at any cost, Vinicius was finally ready to face the consequences of his choices. The investigation had uncovered everything. The offshore accounts, the shady deals, the fraudulent transactions. It was all laid out in black and white, impossible to deny. And he wasn't going to deny it. Not anymore. I'm ready, Vinicius said quietly, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. His lawyer looked up, giving him a small nod of understanding. Are you sure? Once you sign this, there's no going back. You'll be facing significant prison time. I know, Vinicius replied, his mind already made up. It's time I take responsibility. With that, he reached for the pen and signed his name on the dotted line. The sound of the pen scratching across the paper seemed louder than it should have been, almost final in its tone. As soon as he lifted the pen, the room felt different, lighter in a way. The weight of the years of deception lifted from his shoulders. replaced by the heavy reality of what was to come. The lawyer gathered the papers, stood up, and gave Vinicius one last look. "We'll begin the process immediately. You should prepare yourself. This is going to be a long road." Vinicius nodded, his face calm. "I'm ready." As the door closed behind his lawyer, Vinicius leaned back in his chair, staring at the blank walls of the room. He had spent his entire life chasing success, building an empire that had ultimately crumbled beneath him. Now, all that was left was the rubble of his decisions and the prison sentence that awaited him. In the weeks that followed, Vinicius's world changed completely. The headlines plastered his face across every newspaper and website. The once powerful businessman, now a cautionary tale of greed and corruption. The media had a field day with his fall from grace, dissecting every detail of his rise and inevitable collapse. His name was dragged through the mud, his reputation shattered. But despite the public humiliation, Vinicius found a strange sense of peace. He no longer had to pretend, no longer had to uphold the image of success that had been eating him alive. He was free from the lies, even as he prepared to lose his literal freedom. Then came the day of his sentencing. He stood in the courtroom, dressed in a simple suit, listening as the judge read out the charges. The final sentence was severe: years behind bars. But Vinicius took it without flinching. He had known this was coming, and he accepted it fully. He had earned this punishment. As the judge spoke, Vinicius's thoughts drifted to Clara. He hadn't seen her since the confrontation at the gallery, and he wasn't sure if he ever would again. But he held on to the hope that, now that he was paying for his mistakes, she might one day see him differently. He didn't expect her forgiveness. He didn't even expect her to visit. But a part of him, perhaps the only part left that still had hope, wanted her to know that he had changed, that he was trying to be the man he should have been all along. When the gavel finally came down, sealing his fate, Vinicius felt a strange sense of closure. His life as he knew it was over, but in its place was something new, something real. As the guards led him away, the sound of the courtroom fading behind him, Vinicius made a silent vow to himself. He would serve his time, face his punishment, and when he got out, he would try, no matter how hard it was, to rebuild whatever was left of his relationship with Clara. Because, for the first time in his life, he understood what truly mattered. Months had passed since Vinicius's sentencing. The world had moved on, the media frenzy fading as another scandal took its place. But for Clara, the aftermath lingered. She had watched from a distance as her biological father's life crumbled, wondering what it all meant for her. At first, she tried to forget about him, to shove any thoughts of Vinicius to the back of her mind. He had been absent her whole life, after all. What difference did it make now that he was behind bars? But no matter how hard she tried, there was a part of her that couldn't let go, a part that was curious, conflicted, and though she hated to admit it, sympathetic. One afternoon, after weeks of wrestling with herself, Clara found herself standing outside the prison, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what she was doing there. She had told herself she wouldn't come, but something had drawn her here. Maybe the need for answers, maybe the need to finally confront the man who had shaped her life without ever being in it. Inside, the prison was cold and sterile, the sound of clanging metal doors echoing down the halls. As she was led into the visitation room, Clara's hands trembled slightly. She didn't know what to expect, what to feel, or even what to say. Then she saw him. Vinicius sat on the other side of the glass, looking thinner and older than the last time she had seen him. The confident businessman was gone, replaced by a man who had been stripped of everything, both literally and figuratively. But when he saw her, his eyes lit up with a mixture of shock and hope. Clara hesitated, her throat tight, but she forced herself to sit down across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, with years of distance that couldn't be bridged with a simple conversation. "Clara," Vinicius finally said, his voice low and rough. I didn't think you would come." She swallowed, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm not sure why I'm here," she admitted, her voice clipped. I needed to see for myself." Vinicius nodded slowly, understanding that this was all she could offer him right now. He didn't push, didn't try to explain. Instead, he simply looked at her with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude, as if her presence alone was more than he had ever hoped for. "I'm glad you came," he said softly. Clara looked away, the emotions swirling inside her too complicated to express. She wasn't ready to forgive him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But being here, seeing him like this, stirred something inside her, something that wasn't quite anger anymore. "I don't know if I'll come back," she said bluntly, her eyes meeting his once more. "But I'm here now." Vinicius nodded again, a small, broken smile forming on his lips. "That's enough for me." The prison doors clanged shut behind Vinicius as he stepped out into the cool morning air. After serving his sentence, the world felt strange, almost foreign. The once powerful man who had built an empire was gone, replaced by someone more humble, more aware of the things that truly mattered. Clara stood a few feet away, waiting. She hadn't visited him often during his time in prison, but the few visits she had made had marked a slow, tentative shift in their relationship. Each visit was brief, and the conversations were never easy. But the fact that she had come at all gave Vinicius hope. Hope that maybe things could be different now. As he approached her, they stood in silence for a moment, just looking at each other. There was no dramatic reunion, no tears or embraces. But there was something there, a shared understanding that they were no longer strangers, even if they still had a long way to go. Clara broke the silence first. "I thought I'd pick you up," she said, her voice steady but cautious. Vinicius smiled, the kind of smile that held both gratitude and uncertainty. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. They walked to her car, the tension between them lighter than it had been before, though still present. It would take time, years maybe, for them to truly rebuild what had been broken. But Vinicius was patient now, willing to take whatever steps were necessary to earn Clara's trust. He knew he didn't deserve her forgiveness, but he would spend the rest of his life trying to prove he had changed. As they drove through the city, the conversation was minimal. Clara asked how he was feeling, and Vinicius told her the truth. He was nervous, unsure of what came next. He had no money, no company, no status. But for the first time in his life, he didn't care about any of that. The real wealth he sought now was in the relationships he had once thrown away. When they pulled up to a small cafe, Clara parked and turned to him. "I thought we could get something to eat," she said, her tone casual but warm. Vinicius nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and hope. This was her way of saying she was open to trying, open to seeing if they could find some kind of future together. Inside the cafe, they ordered coffee and sat by the window. The conversation was still careful, both of them tiptoeing around the pain of the past. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where the walls between them seemed to lower. Vinicius could see it in the way Clara would smile slightly at something he said, or the way her tone softened when she asked about his plans. Neither of them knew what the future held, but for the first time in years, it felt like a possibility. And that was enough.